Section 1. Mr. Big and the Iceman. The World Before the War. On the evening of July 2nd, 2015, Paul Massey pulled his silver BMW up to the wrought iron gates outside his home on Manchester Road in Clifton, Salford. He had just come back from a holiday at Wincup's holiday camp on the coast of North Wales. It had not been a relaxing trip. His phone had been ringing non-stop. People needed things from him. People always needed things from him. One of his daughters, Kelly, later said her father had seemed distant that weekend, drained and stressed. He had spent the afternoon with two associates, stopped at a local off-licence to buy Bacardi and Cokes, and then driven the short distance home. The house was a large red brick property set back from a busy road. His 5 children knew this house. His 8 grandchildren knew this house. It was the house of the man that half of Salford called Mr. Big, and by the time the sun went down that evening, Paul Massey would be dead on his own driveway, shot 5 times by a man in military clothing carrying a machine gun, and the violent underworld he had spent 40 years building and surviving would swallow itself whole. To understand how Paul Massey ended up dying like that, you have to understand what Salford was and what Paul Massey meant to it. Salford sits right next to Manchester in the northwest of England. It is a city that has always had a tough reputation. The factories and mills that once gave people work had mostly closed down by the time Massey was a teenager, and what was left behind were housing estates with not a lot of money and not a lot of options. Paul Massey was born on January 7th, 1960, in the Ordsall area of Salford. He was one of 6 children, raised by his mother Rose and his father John. By the age of 12, he had already been arrested for criminal damage and was sent to a reform school. That was the start of it. From that point on, Massey and the law were never going to be on the same side. By his 20s, Massey had built a reputation on the streets of Salford as someone you did not want to cross. He was tough, he was smart, and he understood something that a lot of criminals around him did not. That real power did not come from just hurting people. It came from being the person that other people needed. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Massey set up security companies. Through those businesses, he and his associates were able to control who worked the doors of nightclubs across the Manchester area. This was during the time when Manchester's music and club scene was exploding. Huge venues needed security, and Massey's people were the ones providing it. If you wanted to run a club in Manchester or Salford in the 1990s, you almost certainly had to deal with Paul Massey's firm at some point. The money was good, the influence was better. In 1992, during a Salford council meeting called to talk about civil disturbances in the area, a local councillor named Joe Burrows pointed the finger at Massey. He called him Mr. Big, claiming Massey was the man behind the violence and disorder in the city. Massey denied it. He was angry about the label, but the name stuck and it never came off. From that day forward, in the press, in the community, and in the criminal world, he was Salford's Mr. Big. Some people in Salford saw that title as proof that Massey was a dangerous man who made life worse for everyone around him. Others, and this is the part that makes this story complicated, saw him as something closer to a protector. Massey claimed he kept hard drugs off the streets of Salford. He said he used his influence to stop gang violence from getting out of control. He positioned himself not as a criminal boss, but as a man of the people, someone who sorted out problems that the police could not or would not sort out themselves. Whether that was true or not depended entirely on who you asked. But the fact is, hundreds of people lined the streets for his funeral. That does not happen for a man nobody respected. In 1999, Massey's run came to a hard stop. He was involved in a violent incident outside a nightclub in Manchester and was convicted of stabbing a man. The sentence was 14 years in prison. He was arrested in Amsterdam after going on the run and brought back to England to serve his time at Frankland Prison, one of the highest security prisons in the country. He would spend roughly 9 years behind bars before being released in 2007. When he came out, the Salford he returned to had changed. A new generation of criminals had come up while he was locked away. They were younger, louder, and more reckless than the men Massey had grown up with. But they still looked up to him. They still wanted his advice. And one group in particular would pull him right back into the middle of something deadly. That group called themselves the A-Team. They were formed around 2012 a loose collection of about 50 young Salford criminals who were making serious money through drugs, robbery and extortion. They partied in Manchester city centre nightclubs, rubbed shoulders with celebrities and footballers, and liked to show up at events all wearing white like they were in a boy band. Their leader was a young man named Stephen Britton, and Britton looked at Paul Massey the way a student looks at a teacher. Massey was his mentor, his advisor, the older head who had been through it all and could guide the next generation. Whether Massey wanted to be in that position or not, that was the role he filled, and it put a target on his back that he could never take off. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea in Liverpool, there was another man who had tied his life to Paul Massey. His name was John Kinsella. He was 53 years old, a martial arts expert, and a man whose reputation in the Liverpool underworld was built on one thing. He was an enforcer. He was the man you called when you needed a problem to go away. People in Salford knew him by the nickname Scouse because of his Liverpool accent. He and Massey had been friends and associates for years. Kinsella was one of Massey's pallbearers when the time came. Kinsella had his own history. He had previously served a 9-year prison sentence for attempted robbery and carrying a firearm. In 2001, he became involved in something that brought his name into the world of English football. Steven Gerrard, the Liverpool and England captain, was being threatened by a Liverpool gangster known as the Psycho, whose real name was George Bromley Jr. The threats were serious. Bromley was trying to extort money from Gerrard and had threatened to shoot him in the legs. Gerrard's father, Paul, reached out to Kinsella through a family friend. According to a letter Paul Gerrard later wrote to a court, after Kinsella got involved, the threat stopped completely. The Gerrard family never had any more problems from the Liverpool underworld after that. But Kinsella was not a good man who just happened to help a footballer. In March 2006, he was arrested on the M62 motorway near Huddersfield after a 130-mile-per-hour police chase. He and 3 other men from Liverpool had stolen £41,000 worth of goods from a lorry depot in Grantham. Easter eggs, crisps and detergents. When the case went to trial in 2008 at Lincoln Crown Court, Kinsella was found guilty of the robbery. He was sentenced to over 14 years. But he was not even in court to hear the verdict. During a lunch break, while the jury was still out, Kinsella simply walked out of the court building and disappeared. He went on the run. While he was still missing, his lawyers actually managed to get his sentence reduced by 3 years on appeal. He was eventually caught by armed police in Amsterdam in February 2009 and brought back to serve his time. That was the kind of world these men lived in. High-speed chases, robberies, prison escapes, connections to professional football, and a code of loyalty that meant you handled your own problems and you never, ever spoke to the police. Paul Massey was Mr. Big of Salford. John Kinsella was the enforcer from Liverpool who made problems disappear. They were friends. They were associates. And in the criminal world of the northwest of England, they were 2 of the most well-known and feared men walking the streets. They had enemies. They knew they had enemies. In a BBC documentary filmed in the late 1990s, Massey said it plainly. "If it is meant to happen," he said, "it is meant to happen. I know the stakes." He knew the stakes. But he did not know the name of the man who would be sent to collect. A quiet, athletic man from Salford who liked cycling and running and whose calm face earned him the nickname the Iceman. Mark Fellows had been watching both of them for months. And a trivial argument in a nightclub, a drink thrown in someone's face, was about to tear apart every alliance, every loyalty, and every rule that had kept this world in balance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the A-Team's war did not start with bullets. It started with a spilled drink and a punch that turned friends into enemies overnight. Section 2. A drink thrown in a nightclub. The fracture that started a war. The split started over something so small it would be hard to believe if it had not been confirmed in 3 separate criminal trials. According to police, the trigger was a drink being thrown in a nightclub. A woman was punched during the argument. Some reports also mentioned a dispute over a counterfeit Breitling watch. Nobody seemed entirely sure which came first. What everybody agreed on was that it happened in the summer of 2014, and it happened between people who were supposed to be on the same side. The A-Team, the group Paul Massey had been mentoring under the leadership of Stephen Britton, did not break apart because of a police raid or a rival gang moving in from another city. It broke apart from the inside. One of the members involved in the nightclub fallout was a young scaffolder from Salford named Michael Carroll. People in the underworld called him Kazza. Carroll had grown up on the same Ordsall streets as many of the A-Team members. He was tight with several of them. But after the nightclub incident, whatever loyalty had held the group together snapped. Carroll and a handful of others split from Britain's A-Team and formed their own faction. It did not take long for people to start calling them the anti-A-Team. On paper, it looked ridiculous. A gang that named itself after not being the other gang. But what happened next was anything but a joke. These were men who had access to guns, tracking devices, and enough cocaine money to fund a small army. And they were about to tear Salford apart. Among the men who sided with Carroll was Mark Fellows. Born on September 5th, 1980, Fellows was originally from Salford, but had been living in Warrington. He was 34 years old when the split happened. By that point, he had already been convicted 5 times for crimes including robbery and unlicensed possession of ammunition. He had also worked as a sous chef during periods when he was not in trouble with the law. He was a keen runner and cyclist, the kind of man you might see on a bike path and never look twice at. He was quiet, calm. People who met him would not have guessed what he was capable of. That calm earned him a nickname in the criminal world, the Iceman. Fellows was not the leader of the anti-A-Team. Carroll was. But Fellows was the weapon. He was the man Carroll could point at a target and trust to get it done. His co-defendant and childhood friend, Stephen Boyle, who was 35 at the time, had grown up with Fellows in Britain on the streets of Ordsall. Boyle had been arrested in a stolen car at the age of 15 with Carroll. He had gone to school with Paul Massey's daughters. These were people who had known each other since they were children, and now they were on opposite sides of a war that would leave bodies on the streets. The violence started in January 2015. The A-Team made the first move, or at least that was how the anti-A-Team saw it. Masked men from the A-Team used a power saw to cut the roof off a VW Golf belonging to Michael Carroll's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his child. It happened right outside her home. She watched them do it. For Carroll, it was personal. It was a direct message aimed at his family, and it crossed a line. From that point on, the attacks came fast. In February 2015, Carroll's faction struck at one of the A-Team's senior members, a man named Abdul Rahman Khan. Khan was sitting in his Mercedes on Doveleys Road in Earlhams of the Height when 3 shots were fired at point-blank range into the driver's door. He survived. When he got to the hospital, he told staff he had suffered a DIY drilling accident. Police later found a hidden tracker on his car. Weeks later, on March 21st, another A-Team member named Aaron Williams was attacked on Brattis Drive in Swinton. Men with machetes came at him and struck him in the head and neck. His injuries were so severe that his head was nearly cut from his body. He survived only because an off-duty nurse happened to be nearby and gave him emergency first aid on the street. Without that, he would have bled out. Police found a tracker on his VW Scirocco as well. The password to access the tracking devices was Gay Team, which prosecutors later said showed these attacks were directly tied to the gang rivalry. 9 days after the machete attack on Williams, a hand grenade was thrown at the living room window of a house on the Duchy estate in Salford. The house belonged to the family of Ryan and James Coward, both identified by police as A-Team members. Ryan was in jail at the time. His brother James and their parents were home. The grenade exploded outside the house. Nobody was killed, but the message was clear. There was nowhere the A-Team could feel safe, not even in their own homes. Just 17 hours after the grenade attack, the A-Team hit back. A man named Jamie Rothwell, who was close to Michael Carroll — Carroll was godfather to Rothwell's daughter — was shot 3 times at a car wash in Ashton in Makerfield, near Wigan. Rothwell survived. He was well enough to pose for a photograph in his hospital bed the next day, grinning. He refused to speak to the police about what had happened. That was the code. You did not talk. You handled it yourself. By this point, the whole of Salford was living in fear. These were not attacks happening in dark alleys at 3 in the morning. They were happening outside family homes, at car washes, on residential streets in the middle of the day. People who had nothing to do with any gang were afraid to open their front doors. Police were handing out formal warnings to people whose lives were in danger. On June 2nd, 2015, Mark Fellows received one of those warnings. Police told him directly that the A-team considered him a target and that his life was at risk. Fellows did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he started planning. According to what later came out in court, Fellows had been offered £10,000 by the anti-A team to carry out a hit on the biggest target available, Paul Massey himself. Massey was not just any member of the A-team. He was the man the whole group looked up to. He was the mentor, the elder, the one they called Mr. Big. Taking out Massey would not just be a victory in the war, it would be a statement that nobody was untouchable. In the weeks and months before July 2015, Fellows began doing something that looked completely normal on the surface. He went cycling. He had a Garmin Forerunner fitness watch strapped to his wrist, the kind that runners and cyclists use to track their speed, distance, and the routes they take. Fellows used it like a stopwatch, timing his rides. But the watch had a GPS function built into it, and it was recording every route he took. He did not seem to realise, or did not seem to care, that the device was storing data that could later be pulled by anyone who plugged it into a computer. One day, a few months before the murder, Fellows cycled from his home all the way to a field behind a small church that sat directly across the road from Paul Massey's house on Manchester Road in Clifton. The watch recorded the route. It recorded the speed, which was consistent with a man on a bicycle rather than on foot. It recorded that he stopped for 8 minutes at the spot by the church, the exact spot where the gunman would later lie in wait. And then he cycled home. He had found his position. He had timed his escape route. He had done a full dry run for the killing of Paul Massey. Meanwhile, Massey had no idea what was coming. He was aware the gang war was getting worse. He had tried to step in and calm things down. That was why he had gone to North Wales that July. Associates from the A-team had driven out to Wincup's holiday camp to talk to him about the situation. His partner, Louise Lydiot, later said that the weight of it all was getting to him. The crown was heavy in Salford, she said. Massey carried 2 phones that never stopped buzzing. Everyone wanted something from him. He was stressed. He was tired. But he came home anyway, on the evening of July 26, 2015, because that was what he always did. He came home. He stopped at an off-licence to buy Bacardi and Cokes. He drove the short distance to his house. He pulled up outside the wrought iron gates in his silver BMW, and when he stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway, a tall, athletic man in camouflage clothing and a fake beard was already crossing the road toward him, carrying an Uzi submachine gun. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened on that driveway took less than a minute, but it would take police nearly 3 years to prove who pulled the trigger. Section 3. 18 rounds on a Sunday evening. It was a Sunday, July 26, 2015. The time was around 7:27 in the evening and the sun was still up over Salford. Paul Massey had spent the afternoon with 2 associates. He had visited a bookie, then he stopped at a local off-licence, a bargain booze, and bought Bacardi and Cokes. After that, he drove the short distance home to his house on Manchester Road in Clifton. It was a large red brick property with wrought iron gates set back from the road. Across the street sat the parish church of St. Anne. Behind the church there was an open field, and standing in that field, waiting, was a man dressed in camouflage clothing with a fake beard covering his face. He looked, one witness later said, like a soldier from a video game. Mark Fellows had been in position before Massey arrived. He knew which route Massey would take coming home. He knew the layout of the driveway. He had been here before, months earlier, on his bicycle, timing the route, finding the exact spot behind the church where he could watch the house without being seen. He had spent 8 minutes there during that practice run, then cycled home. The GPS watch on his wrist had recorded the whole thing. Now he was back, and this time he was not on a bicycle. He was on foot, and he was carrying an Uzi submachine gun. Massey pulled his silver BMW up to the gates and got out. He had the Bacardi in his hands. He started walking up the driveway. That was when Fellows moved. He came across the road from behind the church, fast, heading straight for Massey. Then he raised the Uzi and opened fire. The first bullets hit Massey in the left shin. Bone shattered. The bottle of Bacardi slipped from his hands and smashed on the gravel. Another round struck 3 fingers on his right hand, tearing one of them clean off. Massey was 55 years old. He had lived in this world long enough to know what was happening. He tried to get away. He raised his hands in defence and dived behind the wheelie bins at the side of his driveway, trying to use them as cover. Crouched there, bleeding, he pulled out his phone and dialed 999. He got through. He was shouting into the phone. "I have been shot," he said. "Hurry up." The operator told him to stay on the line. "Hurry up," Massey said again. "He is shot at," and then the line cut. Some reports say he made 2 or 3 attempts to call before the call connected. Either way, it did not matter. Fellows walked up to the bins and kept firing. 18 rounds came out of the Uzi that evening. 5 of them hit Massey. One of those 5 went through his left side, passed through his ribs, tore through his chest, hit his heart and his lungs, and lodged in his back. That was the bullet that killed him. Paul Massey, Mr. Big, father of 5, grandfather of 8, the man half of Salford either feared or loved, died on the driveway of his own home, next to broken glass and empty bins, while the Bacardi he had bought 10 minutes earlier soaked into the gravel beneath him. He was 55 years old. Fellows did not panic. He did not run in circles. He turned, crossed back over the road, went through the graveyard of the parish church, and disappeared. The escape route was the same one his GPS watch had recorded during the practice run months earlier. He had planned it, he had rehearsed it, and now he followed it, step by step, away from the body of the man he had just killed. Police arrived quickly. They found Massey on the driveway. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Residents on Manchester Road had heard the gunfire. Some had seen the man in the camouflage gear. But this was Salford. And in Salford, people did not talk to police. Not about this. Not about anything involving organised crime. Greater Manchester Police launched a full murder investigation. Detectives from the major incident team took over the case. They searched the area. They gathered what evidence they could. They found 18 bullet casings on the driveway and in the road. They recovered fragments from Massey's body. They knew the weapon was a submachine gun, but they did not have a name. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. Detectives trawled through thousands of hours of CCTV footage. They pulled phone records. They used number plate recognition cameras to try to track vehicles in the area around the time of the shooting. They took countless witness statements. But the problem was the same one that had plagued every investigation into organised crime in Salford for decades. Nobody would talk. Police knew that the gang war between the A-team and the anti-A-team was behind the killing. They knew Fellows was connected to Carroll's faction. He became a person of interest early on, partly because just 2 weeks after Massey's murder, Fellows himself was shot in the hip outside a house in Weast, Salford. He survived. When a police officer spoke to him, Fellows joked that he could have ended up like Paul. But a dark joke and a suspicion were not enough to charge someone with murder. Greater Manchester Police put up a £50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Massey's killer. It was one of the largest rewards offered in the region. It made no difference. The code of silence held. Police eventually linked 112 people to the murder investigation. Not a single one of them cooperated. The reward went unclaimed. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2 years. The investigation stalled. While police struggled to find their man, the gang war did not stop. It got worse. On August 28, 2015, roughly a month after Massey's death, his funeral was held at Agecroft Cemetery in Salford. Around 2,000 mourners lined the streets. Massey's white coffin was draped in Manchester United flags and carried in a horse-drawn carriage pulled by 6 white horses, with 8 bagpipers walking ahead. 55 white doves were released, 1 for each year of his life. John Kinsella, his friend and enforcer from Liverpool, served as one of the pallbearers. But even at the funeral, the war continued. As people gathered at the wake afterwards, word spread that an anti-A-team member named Stephen Lydiot who was the brother of Massey's own partner, Louise, had been attacked at the cemetery. He had been beaten with the wooden poles used to lower the coffin into the ground, and acid had been thrown in his face. Kinsella was named as a suspect in that attack, according to press reports. A man could not even be buried in Salford without violence following him into the ground. 2 months after the funeral, in October 2015, the war produced its most shocking moment. A 7-year-old boy named Christian Hickey and his mother Jane were shot on the doorstep of their home in Winton, Salford. Christian had heard a knock at the front door and gone to answer it, the way he always did when he thought his big sister was coming home. Instead, a gunman opened fire. A bullet went through Jane Hickey's leg and into her young son's leg as he stood behind her. Both of them were left in a pool of blood in the hallway. Both survived, but Christian needed multiple operations and suffered serious physical and psychological damage. He had nightmares about the attack long afterwards. The intended target was believed to be the boy's father, who was a friend of anti-A-Team leader Michael Carroll. The A-Team had come for Carroll's people, and they had hit a 7-year-old child instead. That shooting horrified the entire country. Graffiti began appearing on walls across Salford, aimed at Carroll, calling him a rat and a coward, and telling him to come back from wherever he was hiding and fight his own war. Carroll had fled abroad, to Spain, then believed to be Dubai. He was nowhere near Salford, while people were being shot on his behalf. By the end of 2015, there had been 19 shootings in Salford alone. 45 formal warnings had been given by police to people whose lives were considered to be in danger. The A-Team sent a hit squad to Spain to find and kill Carroll. Police raided their apartment in Marbella in February 2016 and found Stephen Britton, the A-Team leader, along with 2 others. Officers seized a loaded gun, ammunition, knives, a bat, and a weighted vest that, according to news reports, was meant to be used to sink Carroll's body in the Mediterranean Sea. Britton was released on bail by Spanish authorities. Carroll was never found. Back in England, the Massey murder case sat cold. 3 years of police work, thousands of hours of CCTV, a £50,000 reward, and 112 people connected to the investigation, and still no arrest. Mark Fellows was living in Warrington, cycling, running, going about his life. The Garmin watch that held the evidence of his reconnaissance run was sitting in his home, its data untouched. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Then, on the morning of May 5th, 2018, a 53-year-old man took his dogs for a walk near the M62 motorway in Rainhill, Merseyside, with his pregnant partner by his side, and a cyclist appeared behind them on the path. Section 4. The Dog Walk. For close to 3 years after Paul Massey's murder, Mark Fellows walked free. Greater Manchester Police had no arrest, no suspect in custody, and no witness willing to talk. The £50,000 reward sat unclaimed. The case file sat open, but going nowhere. Fellows was living in Warrington, still cycling, still running, still wearing the same Garmin Forerunner GPS watch that held the digital footprint of a reconnaissance run to a dead man's house. And in all that time, the watch just sat in his home, its data untouched, waiting. Then, Fellows decided to kill again. John Kinsella was 53 years old and living in Rainhill, a quiet town in the borough of St Helens, Merseyside, situated close to the M62 motorway. He had been Paul Massey's friend and associate for years. He had carried Massey's coffin at the funeral. He was connected to the A-Team through that friendship. In the eyes of the anti-A-Team, Kinsella was a threat, a hard man with a serious reputation who had ties to the faction they were at war with. As long as Kinsella was alive, the A-Team still had muscle on their side. Kinsella had settled into a routine in Rainhill. Every morning, or close to it, he would walk his dogs along a footpath near the St Helens Linkway, close to the M62. He would go with his partner, Wendy Owen. Owen was pregnant at the time. They had a baby on the way. The walks were regular. The route was predictable. And that predictability was the thing that would get him killed. In late April 2018, Fellows and Stephen Boyle began preparing. One afternoon, Fellows cycled from his home in Warrington to Rainhill, while Boyle drove from his home near Rochdale. The two of them spent close to 2 hours scouting the area, studying the footpath where they knew Kinsella walked his dogs. They watched the route, worked out the timing, and then went home. 2 days later, on April 29, 2018, they came back. This time, the plan was to kill Kinsella. Fellows cycled. Boyle drove his Renault Clio to a position where he could watch the footpath and signal when Kinsella was approaching. Boyle's job was the same as it would be on the day of the actual murder. He was the spotter. Fellows was the trigger. But that morning, the plan fell apart. Boyle arrived too late. Kinsella and Owen had started their walk earlier than the killers expected, and by the time Boyle got into position, Kinsella was already walking along a pavement near his home, rather than out in the open on the footpath. It was not the right moment. The conditions were wrong. CCTV footage later showed Fellows and Boyle meeting up after the failed attempt. They spent 12 minutes together. Prosecutors would later say that those 12 minutes were spent discussing what had gone wrong and how to fix it for next time. Fellows told police a different story. He said the two men had met to arrange a drug deal. The jury did not believe him. At the time, Fellows was working night shifts. He was not free to try again for 6 days. But on the morning of May 5th, 2018, he was. The day was a Saturday. John Kinsella and Wendy Owen left their home in Rainhill at around 6:45 in the morning. They had their dogs with them. They walked along the footpath near the St Helens Linkway, the same path they always took, the one that ran close to the M62 motorway. It was early. The morning was still quiet. Kinsella had no idea that a man on a bicycle had already been cycling toward him from Warrington, and that a silver Renault Clio was parked nearby with a clear line of sight to the footpath. This time, Boyle was in position early enough. He could see Kinsella and Owen approaching along the path. Fellows was on a mountain bike, wearing a high-visibility jacket, black combat trousers, a black snood pulled up over his face, and a baseball cap. Owen would later describe him in court as stone-faced, staring straight ahead, showing no emotion at all. Fellows cycled up behind them. When he was close enough, he pulled out a Webley 6-shot revolver and fired twice into Kinsella's back. Kinsella fell face down onto the path. What happened next is one of the most remarkable details in this entire case. Wendy Owen, who was pregnant, did not run. She charged at the gunman. She went straight at the man who had just shot the father of her unborn child. Fellows turned the gun on her and fired. He missed. Owen turned and ran. She got away. Fellows did not chase her. He had come for Kinsella, and Kinsella was still on the ground. Fellows calmly cycled over to where Kinsella lay face down on the path. He stood over him. Then, he fired 2 more shots into the back of Kinsella's head at close range. John Kinsella was 53 years old. He was an only brother to 8 sisters. He was a father and a grandfather. And in the weeks before his death, he had learned that he was going to become a father again. He would never hold that child. Owen ran from the footpath and flagged down a passing van. The driver, a man named Kevin Plunkett, stopped. He called 999. The recording of that call was later played for the jury at trial. Plunkett could be heard telling the operator that Kinsella did not seem to be breathing and had blood coming from his head. In the background, Wendy Owen was sobbing. Fellows got back on his bicycle and rode away. He cycled home to Warrington. Just hours after shooting a man 4 times and leaving him dead on a footpath in front of the man's pregnant partner, CCTV cameras captured Mark Fellows walking into a KFC restaurant on Gerrard Street in Ashton in Makerfield. He ordered a meal. He sat down. He ate. The footage was later shown to the jury. Merseyside police launched an immediate murder investigation, and this time, unlike 3 years earlier in Salford, the investigation moved fast. The killing had happened in their area, on their turf, and they had fresh evidence to work with. Detectives began pulling CCTV from every camera in the area around Rainhill and tracing the route backward from the murder scene. What they found was a trail that led straight to Warrington and straight to Mark Fellows. CCTV footage showed a cyclist leaving from the area of Fellows' home on the morning of the murder and heading toward Rainhill. It showed the same cyclist returning afterward. It showed Boyle's Renault Clio in the area, parked in a spot with a direct view of the footpath. And it showed the two men in the same area 6 days earlier, on April 29th, during the failed first attempt. The footage was not a coincidence, it was a pattern. Merseyside Police contacted Greater Manchester Police. The two forces compared notes. The similarities between the Massey murder in 2015 and the Kinsella murder in 2018 were obvious. Both victims were connected to the A-team. Both were shot by a lone attacker. Both killers used a bicycle. Both murders showed signs of careful planning. Detectives from the two forces began working together. Fellows was arrested in May 2018, not at his home, but on board an inbound flight at Manchester Airport. Boyle, who seemed to know police were looking for him, was picked up 2 days later at a hotel in Bolton. When officers arrested Boyle, he said something that would be repeated throughout the trial. He told police that he had not murdered anybody, but that he probably knew more about it than he should. It was a strange thing to say. It was not a confession, it was not a denial. It was the kind of thing a man says when he knows exactly what happened and is trying to figure out how much trouble he is in. But the real breakthrough came when police searched Fellowes' home. They were looking for anything that could tie him to the murders. Weapons, clothing, phones, anything. What they found was better than all of that. Sitting in Fellowes' house was the Garmin Forerunner GPS watch he had been using for years. Fellowes had used the watch the way most runners and cyclists do, to time his routes, track his distance, measure his speed. He had treated it like a simple stopwatch. What he either did not know or did not think about was that the watch also had a GPS function. Every route he had ever taken while wearing it had been recorded and stored in the device's memory. Detectives plugged the watch into a computer. What came up on the screen was, in the words of one investigator, a light bulb moment. The data showed that months before Paul Massey's murder in July 2015, the person wearing the watch had travelled from Fellowes' home in Warrington to the area behind the parish church of St. Anne, the exact spot across the road from Massey's house in Clifton, where the gunman had lain in wait. The speed of travel was consistent with someone on a bicycle. The wearer had stopped at the church for 8 minutes, then cycled back home. The route taken on that practice run was identical to the escape route used by the gunman immediately after Massey was shot. The watch also showed routes to the Rainhill area in the days before Kinsella's murder. It mapped out the reconnaissance. It mapped out the failed attempt on April 29th. It mapped out the journey on May 5th. Fellowes had been careful enough not to wear the watch during the actual killings, but the practice runs were all there, saved in the device's memory, waiting for someone to look. For 3 years, Greater Manchester Police had been unable to crack the Massey case. There were no witnesses. There was no confession. The code of silence in Salford had held firm. And then, a fitness watch, a piece of technology designed to help people track their jogging routes, gave detectives more evidence than 112 uncooperative witnesses ever had. The prosecution was led by Paul Greeny, QC. He told the jury at Liverpool Crown Court that the two murders were connected by clear parallels and that the same pair, Fellowes as the gunman, Boyle as the spotter, had carried out both killings. He described the murders as stone cold. He called Fellowes a gun for hire. Fellowes and Boyle used encrypted EncroChat phones to communicate with each other, handsets that cost around £3,000 each and were designed to be impossible for police to crack. The content of their messages was never recovered. But what the phones could not hide was the CCTV footage showing both men in the right place at the right time for both murders, the GPS data from the Garmin watch, and the ballistic evidence linking specific weapons to specific crime scenes. On June 1st, 2018, Mark Fellowes was formally charged with the murders of both Paul Massey and John Kinsella, as well as the attempted murder of Wendy Owen. Stephen Boyle was charged with the murders of both men and the attempted murder of Owen. Both denied everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The trial that followed would last 8 weeks, with armed police carrying machine guns patrolling the corridors of Liverpool Crown Court every single day. Because these were not ordinary defendants, and the people connected to their world were not ordinary spectators. Section 5. A gun for hire. The trial of Mark Fellowes and Stephen Boyle began on November 26, 2018, at Liverpool Crown Court. It would last 8 weeks. From the first day to the last, armed police officers carrying machine guns patrolled the corridors of the building. Security was at a level that few trials in England had ever required. Both defendants had, at a previous court hearing, tried to break out of the building. The people connected to their world, on both sides of the gang war, were considered dangerous enough that the court took no chances. Around 15 relatives of Paul Massey and John Kinsella sat in the public gallery, just a few metres from the dock where Fellows and Boyle were seated. 6 prison officers surrounded the two men at all times. The families of the victims and the men accused of killing them were breathing the same air in the same room, separated by nothing more than a wooden barrier and a row of guards. The prosecution was led by Paul Greeny, QC. He laid out the case plainly. He told the jury that Massey and Kinsella were friends and associates, both well known, if not notorious, in the criminal world of the North West. He said their murders were the result of a deadly feud between 2 gangs in Salford, and that Fellows and Boyle had carried out both killings as a team. Fellows was the gunman, Boyle was the spotter. Greeny described the murders as stone cold, and told the jury there were clear parallels between the two: the use of a bicycle, the careful planning, the reconnaissance trips, the positioning of a lookout. The evidence presented to the jury was built on 3 pillars. The first was CCTV footage. Detectives from both Greater Manchester Police and Merseyside Police had pieced together thousands of hours of camera recordings from the areas around both crime scenes. The footage showed Fellows cycling from Warrington to Rainhill on the morning of Kinsella's murder and returning the same way afterward. It showed Boyle's Renault Clio parked in a position with a direct view of the footpath where Kinsella walked his dogs. It showed both men making the same journey 6 days earlier on April 29th during the failed first attempt. And it placed Boyle's car in the area around Massey's home in Clifton on the evening of July 26, 2015, when Massey was killed. The second pillar was the Garmin Forerunner GPS watch. Detectives showed the jury how the watch, seized from Fellows' home, had recorded a route from his address to the field behind the church across from Massey's house, the exact position the gunman had used. The data showed the journey had been made months before the murder. The speed was consistent with a cyclist. The wearer had stopped for 8 minutes at the spot, then gone home. The escape route recorded by the watch matched the route taken by the gunman after the shooting. The third was ballistic evidence, the analysis of bullets and weapons. At Massey's driveway, 18 shell casings from an Uzi submachine gun had been recovered. At Kinsella's murder scene, the weapon was a Webley 6-shot revolver. The prosecution did not need to find the guns themselves, they had everything else. Fellows and Boyle both denied the charges. Fellows' defence was simple. He said it was all a coincidence that he had been near both murder scenes. He offered no explanation for the GPS data on his watch. Boyle's defence was more complicated and caused a moment in the courtroom that nobody who was there is likely to forget. Partway through the trial, Boyle took the witness stand and turned on his co-defendant. He told the jury that he had not known about the plan to kill Kinsella. He said he had gone to Rainhill that morning to collect drug money from Fellows. He claims that after the shooting, Fellows had cycled up to his car and handed him a rucksack. Inside the rucksack, wrapped in a sock, was the Webley revolver, the gun that had just been used to kill Kinsella. Boyle said this came as a complete surprise to him. He said Fellows had tricked him into being part of a murder he knew nothing about. When Boyle started telling this story from the witness box, Fellows reacted immediately. Sitting in the dock, he made a cutthroat gesture across his own neck and mouthed the word grass at Boyle, his childhood friend, the man he had grown up with on the streets of Ordsall. In the criminal world they came from, calling someone a grass, a snitch, was one of the worst things you could say. It meant Boyle had broken the code. He had pointed the finger at his partner. Whatever bond they had shared since they were teenagers was finished in that moment. The jury did not believe Boyle's story. Neither did the judge. On January 16, 2019, after 31 hours and 3 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned their verdicts. Mark Fellows was found guilty of the murder of Paul Massey, guilty of the murder of John Kinsella, not guilty of the attempted murder of Wendy Owen. Stephen Boyle was found guilty of the murder of John Kinsella, not guilty of the murder of Paul Massey, not guilty of the attempted murder of Wendy Owen. Both men smiled as the verdicts were read out. Fellows smiled and nodded. Boyle dropped his head and gave what reporters described as a wry smile. In the public gallery, the families of the two murdered men sat holding hands, wiping away silent tears. Some left the courtroom in tears before the session was over. Others stayed. Outside the courtroom, members of the Massey and Kinsella families shook hands and shared hugs with the police detectives who had worked on the case for years. As Fellows and Boyle were led from the dock to the cells, members of the Massey family heard Fellows say something to Boyle. The exact words, as reported, were, "It is your fault, you grass." That was the last thing the two childhood friends said to each other in public. Before he was taken out, Fellows also shouted something else from the dock. He said, "I did not shoot at Wendy Owen. She is lying." It was the only thing he said about the case in open court. He never admitted to either murder. He never explained why the GPS data on his watch put him at both murder scenes. He never said a word about Michael Carroll, or the anti-A team, or the £10,000 he was reportedly paid to kill Massey. He just smiled, called his friend a grass, denied shooting at a pregnant woman, and was led away. A member of Kinsella's family, believed to be one of his sisters, screamed from the public gallery as Fellows was taken down. The word she screamed was, "rat." The judge asked her to leave the courtroom. The following morning, January 17th, 2019, both men were brought back to Liverpool Crown Court for sentencing. Mr. Justice William Davis addressed Fellows first. He told him that he was a contract killer, a gun for hire, prepared to kill whoever he was asked to kill. He said he had never had to deal with a contract killer of Fellows' kind before. He said there are few judges who have. He told Fellows that just punishment in his case required him to be kept in prison for the rest of his life. Fellows was sentenced to a whole life term. That meant he would never be considered for parole. He would never apply for release. He would die in prison. At the time, he was one of only around 70 people in the entire United Kingdom serving a whole life sentence. That number tells you how rare and how severe the punishment is. It is reserved for the very worst cases. Boyle was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years before parole could even be considered. The judge told him that his claim of being tricked by Fellows was a lie. He said Boyle had known exactly what he was doing. His job was to spot the victims and take the gun away afterward, and that is what he did. The judge then said something that stayed with the families in the room. He said, "Whatever the background of Mr. Kinsella and Mr. Massey, the impact on their families of their murders has been devastating." The Kinsella family had prepared a statement. A family liaison officer read it on their behalf. The statement described John Kinsella as the only brother to 8 sisters, the backbone of the family, a provider, a protector, a peacemaker. It said he was a devoted father and grandfather, and that in the weeks before his death, he had been delighted to learn he was going to become a father again. The statement said that the family was devastated at the way his life had been taken in such a callous, cowardly, cruel manner. And then it said the thing that sits the heaviest. It said that the person who has lost the most is John's newborn baby, who will grow up without a father, and John will never get to hold and love her. Wendy Owen gave birth to that baby after Kinsella's death. He never met his child. Fellows' defence lawyer, Nick Johnson QC, asked the judge for mercy. He told the court that Fellows was a father of 2 and that a whole life sentence meant he would die behind bars. The judge was not moved. The sentence stood. In June 2019, Fellows appealed his sentence. The appeal was dismissed. The whole life term was upheld. But prison was not the end of Mark Fellows' story. Barely a month after his conviction, in February 2019, Fellows was attacked at HMP Whitemoor, a high-security prison in Cambridgeshire. Another prisoner slashed him with a weapon made from a wooden block packed with 5 razor blades. The injuries were so bad that Fellows had to be airlifted to a hospital by helicopter. He was left with severe wounds to his face. He survived. He was later transferred to HMP Wakefield in West Yorkshire, a prison known as Monster Mansion because of the number of high-profile killers and sex offenders held there. In May 2023, he was stabbed again, this time in the head and neck, by another inmate at Wakefield. He survived that attack as well. Then, in November 2020, Fellows went on trial again, this time for a crime that had happened before the murders of Massey and Kinsella. He was charged in connection with the machete attack on A-Team member Aaron Williams in March 2015, the attack that had nearly severed Williams' head. Fellows was found guilty and received yet another life sentence to run alongside the ones he was already serving. And then came November 2025. On the 5th of that month, a man named Kyle Bevan was found dead in his cell at HMP Wakefield. Bevan had been serving a life sentence for murdering his partner's 2-year-old daughter, Lola James, in Wales in 2020. The little girl had suffered over 100 injuries. 3 prisoners were charged with Bevan's murder. One of them was Mark Fellows. Fellows appeared at Leeds Magistrates Court via video link. He confirmed his name and date of birth and said he understood the proceedings. He was remanded in custody. The case is ongoing. Detective Chief Inspector Carl Jones of Greater Manchester Police, who led the Massey investigation, described Fellows after the original trial as an absolute callous killer who planned everything to the highest degree. Detective Chief Inspector Mark Baker of Merseyside Police said that no human being, no matter what their past, should lose their lives in such violent circumstances. Mark Fellows is currently 45 years old. He is serving a whole life sentence at HMP Wakefield. He will never be released. He will never walk out of a prison gate. The judge who sentenced him told him he would die behind bars, and unless something changes, that is exactly what will happen. Paul Massey was 55 when he died. He left behind 5 children and 8 grandchildren. John Kinsella was 53. He left behind 8 sisters, his children, his grandchildren, and a newborn daughter he never held. The gang war that killed them both started with a drink thrown in a nightclub and a punch that turned friends into enemies. It ended with 2 men dead, 19 shootings in a single year, a 7-year-old boy shot on his doorstep, and a hitman undone by a fitness watch he forgot could track where he had been. The Kinsella family's statement said it plainly. John's newborn baby will grow up without a father. That is not a sentence a judge handed down. That is a sentence that lasts forever. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.